introduce Professor David Roberts, who joins us here from UNE where he is the head of history, and also where he edits the Journal of Australian Colonial History. This is a special edition on Port Arthur, which also demonstrates many of the amazing projects that David's been involved in collaboration with Hamish. But we're thinking that it would be rather splendid if we had a special edition on Port Macquarie. So that's something.
Yeah, definitely. That's what we're looking at. A lot of students working on it at the moment.
Yes, that's something else. It's a great many MAs and PhDs coming through looking at Port Macquarie. So the future is bright.
Thanks, Nancy. It's nice to be back. I feel like sort of amongst old friends. This is not the first time I've been down here talking local history to people who know a lot more about it than I do. So you'll bear with me. What I'm aiming to do today is talk about the closing phases of the Port Macquarie settlement. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the 1828 Commission of Inquiry, which was conducted on the orders of Governor Ralph Darling, a man about who we've heard something already. This will necessarily be a superficial outline in 20 minutes. And I apologise for that because this is actually one of the great epic episodes in the history of colonial Australia and deserves far more detail and analysis than I can give it here. And in due course, that will happen. I know Tamsin in particular has a much greater interest and background knowledge of this than I do. I'm interested in this topic because of, firstly, what it tells us about convict Port Macquarie, but also because of what it tells us about the phenomenon of inquiry in the British world in the early 1800s. The early 19th century was a great age of inquiry. Everywhere around the British world, experts were sent out to gather information and collect data. They were deployed domestically in Britain to investigate all aspects of British society, from the state of prisons and roads, for example. There were commissions of inquiry into marriage laws, into the state and use of turnpikes, into schools, fisheries, municipal corporations, and the supply of coal. Then in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, attention turned to inquiring into empire. And after 1815, of course, the British Empire was a much larger and much more problematic entity than it had ever been before. And in the 25 years after 1815, commissioners were sent to investigate almost every British colony, from the Caribbean to the Cape and Mauritius to Ceylon. And what these inquiries did is they exposed dysfunctions and deficiencies in remote colonial regimes, and they laid out blueprints for the legal and administrative reform of those colonies. Now, one of the first of these great inquiries was, of course, the Commission of Inquiry into the state of New South Wales, conducted by this young character, John Thomas Bigg, and we've heard some discussion of this already. The so-called Bigg Commission was sent to investigate whether Australia could continue to act as a penal colony. And this took place amid growing anxiety and controversy surrounding the administration of Governor Lachlan Macquarie, whose policies were increasingly upsetting powerful people and were being used to embarrass the government in Parliament. And it was anticipated that if penal transportation was to continue to New South Wales, the whole system would need to be overhauled and Macquarie's policies would have to be largely rescinded. And so the Bigg Commission inquiry led to a major redefining of New South Wales. And it was a very multifaceted overhaul of the colony, far too much to detail here. But what it did essentially is it curtailed convict freedoms substantially, and it led to a much more oppressive and terrifying approach to convict management. And a core component of that program, of course, was the establishment of Port Macquarie. It was established in the summer of 1821, as we know, to replace the older settlement at Newcastle. And within a few years, Port Macquarie was massive. We think about 1,100 prisoners were there by 1825. So what was Port Macquarie? In the words of one contemporary, it was, quote, the abode of twice and thrice convicted men, incorrigible for violence and plunder, or for sneaking, pilfering, idleness and cheatery. That is to say, it was a destination for convicts who had committed serious offences and were sentenced to transportation by the criminal court in Sydney, or convicts who were sent there by magistrates, and they had a lesser authority to commit people for relatively minor infractions of the penal code. things such as absconding, insolence, and neglect of duty. And this graph just shows the sentencing authority of around 600 convicts sent to Port Macquarie in 1823. And you can see most of them are coming from magistrates. So most of them are petty offenders rather than being under any sort of serious criminal sentence. This is predominantly a male population. There's only a very small number of women. And the settlement itself is essentially a vast agricultural establishment concentrated on the harbour, but dispersed around a couple of major farms on the hinterland. By the late 1820s, this is also a settlement in decline. By 1826, there had been substantial changes in the state of the settlement after it was quietly realised that most of the convicts had been illegally sentenced there. And in 1826, around 400 convicts were repatriated back to Sydney. So from that point on, from 1826 on, Port Macquarie is a much smaller settlement. It's past its heyday, it's dwindling away, and it's becoming eclipsed by the big new penal stations at Moreton Bay and Norfolk Island. And in the process, I think Port Macquarie becomes a little forgotten, becomes very neglected. In fact, by mid-1828, we think there's only about 300 people there. Does that sound right, Tom? So it's very small, it's much reduced. So what's going on? There's many reports at this time that Port Macquarie is not in good shape. There's been desertions aplenty, and we heard this morning about some of the more serious lawlessness that was happening in the mid-1820s. There's reports of hardship and brutality at the settlement, which the authorities don't mind that. It's meant to be a place of terror. But at the same time, some of these stories are starting to provide fodder for the government's critics. Increasingly, stories of brutality at Port Macquarie are being used to try and embarrass Governor Darling. The settlement itself is in bad repair. We've heard today about the tradesmen who came up and built the settlement. Within 3 or 4 years, it was virtually falling down. The crops are being plundered by Aborigines who are continuing to fight sporadically with convicts and soldiers. And there's also hints of irregularities and unofficialities. Is that actually a word? Didn't come out well in spell checker. It's a quote from the press. This is essentially hints of petty corruption at Port Macquarie. Naming in particular Mr. Gilbert Smith, who was a free settler appointed as the local government storekeeper, and he's reportedly engaging in trading and farming activities of a suspicious nature. There's hints that convicts are being paid to undertake work in their own time, which was considered very improper for convicts at a penal station. There were concerns that civil and military officers were misappropriating government resources and making private use of convict labour. This happened everywhere, of course, but by the 1820s, there's a new culture of bureaucracy and accountability, which is starting to make these practices look a little bit noticeable. It's also noticed at this time that a lot of convicts are coming back to Port Macquarie coming back from Port Macquarie with commercial quantities of pork. And it happens over and over again, and it starts to seem a little bit suspicious. Most critically, what we're seeing, and I think this is critical, is dysfunctions in the management structure at Port Macquarie. That is, all the civil and military officers are arguing amongst themselves and relentlessly complaining about one another. And now this is something of a British phenomenon. It happens throughout the Empire, it happens throughout New South Wales. And many commissions of inquiry, including the big commission to New South Wales, is motivated in part by squabbling and bickering amongst officials and by hints of scandalous accusations. And clearly this is a huge problem at Port Macquarie. There are problems in the command structure. No one actually knows who's really in charge. A lot of local officials regard themselves as being independent of the commandant. And in fact, you can see that some of them are actually earning quite a lot more than the commandant. There's a lot of egos at play, I think it's fair to say. And these internal shenanigans, for example, resulted in the dismissal of Thomas Allison Scott, who we talked about this morning, as the agriculturalist in charge of the sugar. Is that right? He's removed just before the Port Macquarie inquiry, essentially because he's excessively argumentative and vexatious. You just can't get along with anyone. And they end up just having a gutful of it, and they just can't tolerate it anymore. So in sum, what the 1828 inquiry is trying to do is untangle some of these complex interpersonal disputes, and it's set up to investigate some potentially dodgy accountancy and shady business dealings. So 2 blokes are appointed. One is Lieutenant Colonel James Thomas Morissette, who's one of our favourite colonial characters, formerly the Commandant of Newcastle. He later gains considerable notoriety as the Commandant of Norfolk Island. And at this time, he's the Superintendent of Police based in Sydney. And he is considered to be very much an imperial expert on matters relating to punishment. In fact, you know, people in the British government take his opinions. We'll come back to that. The other commissioner is a much younger bloke, James Busby, who was the Collector of Internal Revenue. I'm not sure what his credentials are, but I suspect he just didn't have anything better going on at the time. So they sent him along with Morissette. But the commission report is essentially Morissette's work. Instructions are given on the 3rd and 5th of June, 1828, which summarised to investigate discrepancies in the agricultural establishment, to look into the management of the Commissariat Department. They're going to look particularly into the conduct of Mr. Bell, who is known to be defying the Commandant's orders. There are irregular indulgences for particular individuals and the private use of convict tradesmen. So they're all specific recommendations. Then there's a couple of general ones. To look at the general conduct of all departments and into any other matter that may appear to warrant investigation. So it's a very, very open-ended inquiry. Now, we don't know too much about what the inquiry actually did, or I don't as yet, based on current research. They certainly conducted lengthy interviews with officers and overseers. They would have inspected the facilities and they would have looked at as much of the settlement's documentation as they could get their hands on. And from what we know of other inquiries, they actually single people out and say, I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you, I want to talk to you. But they would also invite people to come forward. And so what they would get is a lot of gossip and a lot of scandal and people having an opportunity finally to say something that's been on their mind. What they found, in short, was that the management of Port Macquarie was suffering from considerable inexperience and ineptitude, especially in the agricultural department. The Superintendent of Agriculture, William Parker, was grossly overestimating the extent of produce under cultivation. He was essentially big noting himself. And that he was then, there was a huge discrepancies between how much he said he was growing and how much was actually in the store. And what they found was that he was dishonestly covering up his mistakes. They declared him to be basically slack, unqualified, and in some respects guilty of culpable negligence. And I think he lost his job. Unsurprisingly. Yeah. A rare piece of accountability in the civil service. The commissioners were also critical of a long and pervasive practice of allowing civil officers to have prisoners, or to cultivate their own land. In fact, some convicts were being allowed to cultivate their own gardens and keeping poultry and pigs. Now, that was a sensible practice to help sustain the local population, but the problem is that it led to forms of private profiteering that relied on the misappropriation of government resources. There were problems with bookkeeping in the Commissariat Department. Staff in that department were thought to be engaged in illegal trafficking within the settlement. There was a lot of people identified as having particularly bad tempers, arguing with the Commandant in a manner that was shockingly disrespectful, particularly for a penal settlement. It was thought that this is a place where discipline needed to be really strict. And yet you get a ridiculous situation where officers living in houses next door to each other are writing angry letters, sending it across the street. It was not a good look, and it brings the whole structure into disrepute. The commissioners also uncovered an apparent scam involving the production and sale of pork, not surprisingly. Essentially, everyone's growing pigs, often fattened by government grain, and this is pork that is capable of fetching really good prices if you could find a way to sell it. So the scam is that the storekeeper is A, declaring the government supplies of beef to be rotten, B, getting permission to replace that beef with pork, and C, purchasing local pork at inflated prices through processes that obviously involved surreptitious collusion. And there's a whole range of findings, okay? Port Macquarie does not come out well from this inquiry. There's evidence of illegal trading, the dam that they've built to power the mill is rubbish, the overseer of stock can't do his job because he's blind. There's just not enough discipline, there's not enough work going on. And so basically the whole operation is declared to be basically lax and derelict. There's also hints of local scandals, of course. There's improper and indecent relationships between officials and convict women, which is actually an accepted part of these situations. The problem is that they weren't being very discreet about it, and everyone was all offended that officers were walking down the street with their convict wives or partners. So the commissioners return to Sydney, they write up their report and they make a series of recommendations which read in part like a general restatement of the principles behind penal settlements. Now, where did it go wrong? There is a fallout to the inquiry. As we said, key civil officers are sacked. They're losing some very well-paid jobs. Others fall on their swords and resign. There's talk of a court-martial to investigate some of the matters, but strangely, that does not proceed. There's another interesting coda in that, I noted that critics of the government are using Port Macquarie and similar settlements as a way to embarrass the government. In February 1829, the Sydney Monitor launches an extraordinary attack on the Port Macquarie Commandant, Captain Crotty, claiming that he himself is in fact the main source of all the corruption on the settlement, that he is the primary trafficker in pigs, that he's appropriating government materials, and that he's cooking the books. And a number of documents and witness statements are actually published in the press to substantiate those claims. Crotty files a criminal action, then much as now. If you don't like what the papers are saying about you, you sue them. He sought a conviction for libel, and in fact the editor was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months jail. In fact, I think he was already in jail for libel. Edward Smith Hall, the editor, was a serial libeller. But I guess the point is that the accusations and counter-accusations around this episode go on for years. 3 or 4 years later, they're still debating in the press whether Captain Crotty is a crook. We don't know what happened to him. He got promoted. Of course, that's the other certainty, is when a public official is accused of such, you promote them. But the primary outcome of this is the creation in 1829 of this set of general regulations for the future management of penal stations. It's crafted by a special board appointed to ensure that the mistakes at Port Macquarie are never repeated. And these require more attention. These are one of the great historical gems of Australian history. They are a very stern and extensive set of regulations, 81 rules in total. And it's essentially a manifesto for the running of an outdoor penitentiary. And it constitutes a very distinctly Australian contribution to the history of criminological thinking and planning. It's a very, very remarkable document that hasn't really had much analysis as yet, and it requires a lot more from both Australian and international historians. So in conclusion, just to summarise that very brief overview, the Port Macquarie inquiry of 1828 is interesting in a number of ways. It is a microcosmic example of a much larger phenomenon, and from it we learn much about the British rage for inquiry in the 19th century. We see, for example, how the process of inquiry is motivated by and becomes embroiled in the business of investigating personal disputes and scandalous arrangements. We do, of course, learn a lot about the lives and labour of convicts and masters operating in a remote and dispersed station on the fringes of the colony at a time when the settlement has been largely ignored and forgotten. This is a story of laxity, mismanagement, racketeering and fraud, the things that men get up to when they are somewhere they don't want to be and no one is watching. It shows that inquiries were not neat and tidy affairs. They dealt with matters that were complex and messy, and they had the potential to open cans of worms that could have serious repercussions for many years. And in this case, led to a whole host of sort of subsidiary disputes and grievances. Inquiries were intended to result in reform, and their key purpose is to rein in sort of local vagaries and abuses and to replace them with more uniform standards of transparency and accountability. In the case of Port Macquarie, the ultimate determination is that the settlement could not be reformed, and it was eventually shut down soon after, and the area was open to free settlement. But for me, what the main outcome of the inquiry is this set of regulations for the management of penal stations. These are, as I've said, very, very significant historically. They not only shape the future directions of convict management in New South Wales, but they are, I argue, a monumental moment in the debates and practices surrounding the management of crime and punishment in the 19th century British world. And these are internationally significant in terms of the philosophies and practices that are emerging in the age of the modern penitentiary. And for this, Port Macquarie can take much credit. At the end of the day, the Port Macquarie inquiry was a blueprint of what punishment should and should not be. Thanks.
Question?
Yes. I've got, he needs a microphone.
I got a loud voice.
I think the,
No, I've got to look for the recording.
Henry Gilman would have been most guilty of all the people you were just talking about.
yes.
He built cedar furniture, he sold it to Sydney for a profit. He even took 20 crates to Sydney when he dodged the inquiry and was promoted to a major. How did he get away with it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly correct. He got away with it because it's a military government. Are they in the same regiment, Gilman and Darling? I'm not sure. The main thing is Gilman was gone and dusted by now. He's not even in the country, in fact, is he?
I'm not sure.
That's essentially, and in the report sent to the British government, they do say, they kind of also say, oh, well, you know, it's in the past, we're not really sure what happened there. It's a matter of honor, so we won't defy his name. Tamsin knows a lot more about this, but the whole government response to it is a little bit dodgy. Like there is talk of a court martial, and I think they're going to have a look at Crotty and they're going to have a look at other officials, but it just doesn't happen.
No, and there was a clerk that Meg talked about this morning, Charles DeRoche, and he is mysteriously one of the few that gets a ticket of leave ever, just as the inquiry is getting going. Because the thing about the Commandant's clerk is, he knows where all the bodies are buried. So they ship him off down south and ticket of leave pronto.
There's also the story of Gilbert Smith, of course, the storekeeper, who was sacked, and he died shortly after in an arsenic poisoning. Now, let's not jump to any conclusions about conspiracies, but, you know.
The monitor just only jumped to them, didn't they? They felt that Gilbert was
he was a victim. Yeah. He lost his family in that accident. It was an arsenic kitchen accident. But you don't have a government scandal without cover-up and conspiracy. Let's imagine that. Nothing's changed.
Anyone else have any questions for David?
Okay, well, thanks very much. Enjoyed that. It's terrific. Nice to see you again.